Have you ever had a peaceful getaway suddenly turn into chaos? Well, that's exactly what happened to me one quiet Saturday afternoon. I had just finished a long week of work, and all I wanted was to spend the weekend in my lake house, relax, and recharge. But what I didn't expect was to be caught in a tug-of-war with a Karen from my HOA, Homeowners Association. It all started when I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. On the other end was a woman with an overly confident, almost smug voice. She introduced herself as Linda, a member of the HOA. At first, I thought she was calling about the usual neighborhood complaints, the kind of thing you expect when you live in a community with a strict HOA. But this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. "Hi, I'm calling because you've got a large group arriving at your lake house this weekend," Linda said, her voice brimming with an air of authority, as though she were stating an undeniable fact. I felt a surge of confusion ripple through me as I listened to her words. There was no way she could be talking about my property. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend, a chance to unwind, enjoy the calm of the lake, and do absolutely nothing. But now, here was this woman on the phone, casually telling me I was expecting 80 guests. I blinked, trying to grasp what was happening, but all I could do was frown. My heart began to beat a little faster as I checked my calendar mentally. No events, no bookings, nothing even remotely close to what she was describing. I hadn't even planned to host anyone, let alone a group of 80. There was no email, no call, no reservation of any kind that I could recall. It was almost as though she was talking about someone else, someone who'd reserved a different lake house, perhaps, but certainly not mine. "Excuse me," I managed to say, keeping my tone as calm as possible. I could feel a slight tension building in my voice as I tried to process the absurdity of the situation. "I think you've got the wrong house. I'm not hosting any large party." It was hard to believe what I was hearing. How could someone just assume that I had agreed to host such a massive event? The lake house was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of the world. The thought of a large party, of strangers overrunning my home, sent a wave of unease over me. It was a place I shared with family and close friends, not an event space for random, oversized groups. But Linda didn't seem fazed. In fact, she was remarkably confident as she continued to speak, as though she'd already done all the groundwork and the event was already a done deal. No, she said, almost condescendingly. "I've personally confirmed everything. Your property is booked for a large event, and everything has been arranged through the HOA's booking system." I could almost hear the smugness in her voice as she explained this, as though this was an official, unchangeable fact. "This is a community event," she went on, as though that should make me feel better about the idea. "There are 80 guests coming, and they're all expecting to enjoy the lake house facilities this weekend. It's all been cleared." Her words hung in the air like a thick fog. My jaw dropped. This couldn't be real. Not only was she telling me that I had somehow agreed to this event, but she was telling me that I had, in fact, reserved my own property to host 80 people. 80. The sheer audacity of it made me feel like I had been transported to some bizarre alternate reality. I ran through my mental calendar again, trying to think of any moment in time when I might have mistakenly signed up for such a thing. There were no emails, no phone calls, no paperwork, no signatures, nothing. In fact, I hadn't even agreed to let anyone near the house that weekend. But she was adamant, and as she kept talking, I realized that she wasn't going to back down. "You don't need to worry about the details," she continued. "The HOA has already taken care of all that. The event will be fully organized and will run smoothly. I'm just calling to remind you that the guests will be arriving soon, so you should prepare for their arrival." I wanted to scream, but I kept my composure. I could already feel a headache forming at the thought of it all. "But Linda," I interjected, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I didn't agree to this. I didn't authorize any event for this weekend, and I certainly didn't book anything through the HOA. You're mistaken." But Linda wasn't hearing it. She was persistent, speaking to me as though I were the one in the wrong, as if my refusal to accept her story was the problem. "Well, I don't know how it happened," she said, her voice slightly irritated now. "But I can assure you, your property is definitely booked. I've got confirmation here. I've spoken with the HOA management team, and they've all said everything is fine. It's in the system, and there's no reason to be worried. The event is scheduled, and it's happening this weekend." As she kept speaking, I felt a creeping sense of disbelief. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Could she be confusing me with someone else? Maybe my property had been double booked by mistake, or perhaps another house with a similar name had been reserved. But no matter how hard I tried to reason through the situation, nothing added up. I tried to slow the conversation down. "Linda, this is really confusing. I'm telling you, I didn't book anything. I'm not hosting a large group, and I have no idea what you're talking about." But she didn't back off. "Well, that's what the system says," she shot back, almost too quickly. "And I'm not the one who made the reservation. I'm just the messenger here. So, as I said, get prepared. The guests will be arriving soon." I was stunned. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to argue further, but I also didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. I tried to keep a level head, but the feeling of frustration gnawed at me. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding anymore. It felt like she was trying to impose something onto me that I never agreed to. And there was a part of me that started to wonder if this wasn't a mere mistake at all. Was Linda deliberately trying to push me into hosting this event, even though I had no part in it? Could this whole thing be some kind of power play? I was silent for a few moments, trying to think of a rational response. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about a booking mistake. It was about someone trying to take control of my property, to make decisions for me that I hadn't agreed to. And the worst part was that Linda didn't seem to care. She was convinced that everything was settled, and her mind was made up. It was then that a small spark of determination ignited in me. There was no way I was going to let someone else dictate what happened at my house, especially not when I hadn't agreed to any of it. I took a deep breath and said, "Linda, I'm telling you once again, you're mistaken. I have not agreed to this event. You need to cancel any plans involving my property immediately. I will not be hosting 80 guests this weekend. Please make sure that's clear." For a brief moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then she replied, her voice tight with tension, "We'll see about that." And that was when I knew that things were about to get a lot more complicated. I quickly started to piece things together in my mind, though the fragments felt disconnected, like jumbled puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. At first, I entertained the possibility that there had been some kind of innocent mistake. Maybe Linda had simply mixed up the booking information with someone else's reservation. After all, mistakes happen. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. Something much bigger was at play here. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Linda was insistent. No matter how many times I told her that I had no recollection of booking any event for the weekend, no emails, no confirmations, nothing. She kept repeating that the reservation had been confirmed by me. She even went so far as to mention a series of emails that I had never seen. Emails that she claimed were sent, confirming every detail, confirming the event. I was sure I hadn't received anything. No inbox messages, no notifications, not a single reminder. And yet, she sounded so convinced, like she had the complete backing of some authoritative system, the kind of system that should have made me trust her words. But the more she spoke, the more it became clear to me that Linda was not simply misinformed. There was a moment when I stopped trying to reason with her and simply listened. That was when my gut instinct kicked into high gear. A cold wave of realization washed over me. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This wasn't a harmless misunderstanding. Linda wasn't just an overly confident HOA representative who had gotten the details wrong. No, this was something far more calculated. The thought hit me like a ton of bricks. Linda wasn't just confused about the reservation. She was trying to pull something off. It wasn't just about finding a place to throw a party. Something much deeper was happening. She had no intention of admitting her mistake. Instead, she was doubling down on her claims, as though this entire event, this supposed booking, was an undeniable truth. She was forcing me into a narrative that I knew wasn't mine. She wasn't looking for a venue for an event. She was looking to take control of my property for her own purposes. And at that very moment, everything about this situation started to smell fishy. I could almost feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, suffocating me, as though she was trying to manipulate me into submission. The audacity was incredible. The sheer boldness of her attempt to convince me that she had the authority to claim my property, without my consent, made my blood boil. How could she possibly think that I would just roll over and allow this to happen? Was I really supposed to just accept that she had some right to turn my quiet, personal retreat into a chaotic party for strangers? It was insulting. I was a private individual, and my lake house was my sanctuary, my escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But here she was, telling me that not only had I agreed to an event that would completely disrupt my peaceful weekend, but she was also acting like she had every right to expect me to welcome these guests. As Linda continued to rattle off information about the supposed booking, dates, times, even the number of guests, it became apparent to me that she wasn't simply misinformed. She was deliberately making things up, embellishing details, weaving a story that she expected me to swallow. The more I pushed back, the more forceful her responses became, as though she had something to prove. She didn't seem like a person interested in getting to the truth. She seemed like someone trying to force a narrative where none existed. I wondered briefly if perhaps there was something more sinister at play. Could she be part of some larger scheme? Was this an attempt to strong-arm me into hosting the event, perhaps to meet some internal HOA goal or agenda? That seemed far-fetched, but as the minutes dragged on and her insistence grew more fervent, I began to consider all possibilities. Linda was a woman who didn't seem to take no for an answer, and that alone was a red flag for me. She wasn't simply someone making an innocent mistake. She wasn't even someone trying to find a solution to a booking error. Linda was trying to take control of something that wasn't hers to control. What was even more frustrating was the fact that she was completely dismissing my rights as the owner of the property. She was speaking to me as if the lake house was a public space, as if my ownership didn't matter in the face of some HOA policy or communal need. It was as though she was convinced that the HOA had some greater claim to my property than I did, and in her mind, I was just supposed to accept that. No questions asked. As she continued to pressure me, I could feel my patience wearing thin. She was relentless, and I was starting to see this as a battle of wills. She had a purpose. She had an agenda, and she was trying to impose it on me. There was no question about it anymore. Linda was playing a game, and I was caught in the middle. It wasn't about a booking error anymore. It was about power, about control, about forcing me into submission, even when I had every right to stand my ground. And that made everything worse. She wasn't just mistaken. She wasn't just making an innocent error. She was trying to manipulate the situation to get what she wanted. It was at that point that I realized how far she might be willing to go. If she was willing to lie about emails, to insist that I had confirmed the booking when I hadn't, what other lengths would she go to in order to take control of the situation? Would she attempt to show up with the 80 guests anyway, hoping I'd back down? Would she involve the HOA in a way that forced my hand? What other tricks did she have up her sleeve? My mind raced with questions. But one thing became clear. Linda wasn't just going to let this go. She was determined to push her agenda, and it was up to me to stop her. My stomach churned as I thought about my next steps. I couldn't allow this to continue. I had to take control of the situation before it spiraled even further. The problem was, I didn't even know where this was headed. But one thing was for certain. Linda had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let her walk all over me. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became to put an end to this farce. I needed to protect my property. I needed to protect my rights. And most importantly, I needed to show Linda that I wasn't someone she could steamroll. In that moment, as I sat there listening to her talk about the confirmed booking, I knew I was about to enter into a battle that I couldn't afford to lose. It wasn't just about this weekend or this supposed event anymore. It was about setting a precedent. It was about making sure that I, as the property owner, wasn't just a bystander to the whims of an overreaching HOA member who thought she could take what she wanted. I wasn't just going to roll over, not without a fight. At this point, I wasn't angry. I wasn't ready to lash out or let my emotions take control. Instead, I was calculating, methodically running through my options in my head. I knew I had two clear paths in front of me. I could either give in, Let this HOA Karen have her way, and let the weekend unravel into chaos. Or I could take a stand and draw some very serious boundaries. In a way, it was a test of my resolve, of how far I was willing to let someone push before I made it clear that I would not tolerate their intrusion into my life. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands were slightly clammy. My heart was beating a little faster than normal, but I knew I had to remain calm. If I let her see my frustration, if I allowed myself to get caught up in her theatrics, I would lose. This wasn't just about one mistaken reservation. This was about maintaining control, not just of my property but of my own life. If I allowed someone like Linda to steamroll me, then where would it end? Would I be giving her a foothold in my personal space? My sanctuary? The lake house I had worked so hard to secure for my own quiet enjoyment? I had worked long hours, sacrificed a lot to have that retreat, a place where I could leave the world behind, a place where I didn't have to worry about responsibilities, where I could breathe in the fresh air and listen to the peaceful sounds of nature. To have someone come in and disrupt that, to tell me that I was now responsible for 80 strangers simply because Linda said so, that was something I couldn't and wouldn't tolerate. I realized in that moment that if I didn't set some serious boundaries, I'd be setting a precedent that could allow others to take advantage of my property, my time, and my peace. Linda had no right to commandeer my lake house, no right to take control of my weekend, and certainly no right to push me into a decision that wasn't mine to make. She was just a part of the HOA, a group that was supposed to help maintain the neighborhood and protect residents' interests, not run roughshod over them. So, I decided to take a more calculated approach. Instead of letting anger dictate my actions, which, frankly, would have been easy at this point, I focused on the facts. I needed to calmly address her, to give no room for doubt, and to make sure she understood that I was in control of the situation, not her. I spoke slowly, deliberately. "I'm sorry, but there must be some sort of misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice steady, though internally my frustration was bubbling beneath the surface. "I haven't agreed to anything like this. In fact, I never authorized any large group bookings for my property." I could tell, even through the phone, that Linda wasn't convinced by my calm demeanor. Her response was immediate, sharp, and dismissive. "Well, it's all in the system," she shot back, her tone growing impatient. "The HOA has everything confirmed. You've been informed. The event is scheduled, and your property is listed as the venue. The guests will be arriving shortly." It was clear that she wasn't listening to me. It didn't matter what I said. She was determined to follow through with her plan, regardless of what I had to say about it. It wasn't a mere booking error. It wasn't a simple case of a mix-up. Linda wasn't just confused. She was pushing an agenda. The more I tried to correct her, the more she dug her heels in, as though it was already a fait accompli, as if the event was inevitable, like it had been written in stone. And at that moment, something clicked inside me. I realized that I was no longer dealing with a woman who had made a simple mistake. I was dealing with someone who was trying to manipulate the situation to her benefit. She was trying to assert control over something that wasn't hers to control. The thought gnawed at me, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my anxiety. I could feel the adrenaline starting to build in my chest as the frustration grew, but I kept my voice calm, measured. I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. But what she didn't realize was that I had been in situations like this before. I had faced stubborn, manipulative people who believed they could get their way through force and intimidation, and I knew the only way to deal with them was to stand my ground. My resolve strengthened as I continued to speak. I wasn't going to allow this woman to steamroll me, no matter how confidently she spoke. I wasn't going to let her twist the facts to suit her narrative. "Linda," I said, my voice firm but not harsh, "I'm telling you again, this is not happening. I have not booked any event. I haven't confirmed any details, and I haven't authorized a large group of guests. This is a mistake, and it needs to be fixed." There was a long silence on the other end. It was like she was waiting for me to cave, waiting for me to back down, to show a sign of weakness. I could almost hear her thoughts. "He'll crack soon. Everyone cracks eventually." But I didn't crack. Not this time. Not in this situation. Linda's voice finally returned, colder than before. "Well, I don't know what you think you're going to do, but the guests will be arriving soon, and I expect you to honor this reservation." The way she said it made my blood run cold. It was a threat, a veiled ultimatum, and I could sense the power play she was trying to make. She wanted me to feel like I had no choice but to comply, like this was a done deal. But the thing was, she was forgetting one very important detail. This was my property, not hers. And I wasn't about to let her dictate what happened on it. It was in that moment that I knew I had to make a decision. I had two choices in front of me. I could either let her have her way, let her treat me like some kind of doormat, or I could take definitive action to protect what was mine. And that was when I made my decision. I wasn't going to let anyone, not Linda or anyone else, take control of my property or my weekend. I wasn't about to let her impose her will on me, and I wasn't going to let her push me into a situation I hadn't agreed to. I knew what I had to do. I was going to make sure no one stepped foot on my property that weekend. I was going to lock down my lake house, secure it, and ensure that Linda couldn't pull off her little scheme. The time for polite conversation had passed. It was time to take a stand. I wasn't about to let this woman walk all over me, and I wasn't going to let her ruin my weekend. My mind was made up, and now it was just a matter of executing my plan. I hung up the phone with Linda, my heart pounding in my chest. This was far from over, and I knew it. But I also knew that I had the upper hand. It was my property, my space, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me. I went to the lake house that afternoon to prepare for the inevitable. The air was thick with anticipation, a strange cocktail of tension and determination as I made my way down the familiar path that led to my property. The lake house was usually my retreat, my sanctuary, but today it felt different. It felt like the calm before a storm. I knew deep down that Linda was going to show up. I could practically hear the screeching of her tires as she would race toward the gate, her group of 80 guests in tow, probably already half-dressed for a party she expected to happen. I wasn't naive enough to believe she'd just let this go. She had already demonstrated that she wasn't one to accept defeat easily. In her mind, the event was confirmed, and my protests didn't matter. No matter what I said, no matter how much I tried to stand my ground, she was determined to force her way in literally. And that's exactly what I couldn't allow to happen. So, I decided that I needed to act quickly, decisively. I had to stop her in her tracks before things got any worse. I couldn't just rely on calm words and polite refusals anymore. This was now a matter of ownership, control, and most importantly, protecting what was mine. Linda had already shown that she wasn't going to respect my boundaries, so it was time for me to show her that I was the one in charge here, not her or the HOA. I started with the gate. The driveway was wide and open, usually welcoming guests with an open expanse that led right up to the house. But not today. Today, I was going to turn that welcoming path into a barrier. I walked over to the old, rusted gates and pulled out the thick, heavy-duty chain I had already prepared earlier. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be broken or easily removed. It was a security chain designed to withstand force, and that's exactly what I needed it for. With a few strong twists of a lock and the heavy chain wrapped tightly around the poles, I secured the gates with purpose. I could feel the weight of the moment as the metal links clicked into place, as if locking out not just Linda, but her entire unreasonable request. But I didn't stop there. No, if I was going to make a statement, I needed to be thorough. I wasn't about to give her any chance to slip through the cracks. I walked down the driveway, making sure every entry point was sealed off. I checked the small side gates, the back entry, and even the old wooden fence that separated the property from the woods beyond. Each one was locked down, secured, and completely inaccessible. I had been meticulous. Linda wasn't going to waltz in here with her so-called 80 guests, acting like she had the right to commandeer my property. And then, just to ensure I wouldn't miss a single moment of this confrontation, I set up my cameras. I wasn't sure what exactly would unfold, whether Linda would show up alone, furious and demanding, or if she'd come with a backup crew, trying to force her way in by sheer numbers. But I knew one thing. I wanted to capture every second of it. I needed to have proof of what she was about to do, of the way she was trying to overstep boundaries that were firmly mine. My cameras weren't just for security. They were a way for me to hold her accountable, to record the exact moment she realized she wasn't going to get her way. The evening came quickly. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the water, painting the landscape in a soft, golden hue. It should have been peaceful, tranquil, the kind of evening where the world feels still, where you can just sit back and listen to the rustle of the trees, the lapping of the water. But instead, the stillness was broken by the sight of her car pulling down the driveway. There was no mistaking her. The sleek sedan rolled in, headlights flashing briefly in the fading light, and I could see her behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel with what I imagined was a look of pure determination. Linda wasn't alone, but the 80 guests she'd spoken about were nowhere in sight. Instead, it was just her, just Linda, driving up to my gate, as though she had already decided that the entire situation was under her control. I watched her park, a bit haphazardly, as if she was in a rush. I could almost hear her muttering to herself from across the distance, probably cursing me, probably making a mental note of all the excuses she would give when she realized she was locked out. She got out of the car, striding toward the gate, with that same air of entitlement she had displayed earlier over the phone. I watched her unseen as she approached the chain that I had wrapped around the gate. She didn't pause to consider the fact that the chain was thick, heavy, and locked securely in place. Instead, she tugged at it, as if brute force would be enough to make it give way. I had to bite back a smile at how predictable she was. Of course, she thought she could just pull at it and make it give. But this wasn't a flimsy lock. This wasn't something that could be opened by anyone who simply had a strong arm or a loud voice. Linda's frustration began to build immediately. I could see her yank on the chain again, harder this time, like she was trying to summon some supernatural force to break it. She pulled and tugged at it with all her might, her face reddening as the effort proved useless. She stepped back, scanned the situation, then tried again, her fingers slipping and fumbling, but still unable to loosen the chain even slightly. Her face was turning crimson now, a mixture of rage and disbelief painting her expression. I could almost feel her heart rate increase with every failed attempt. And with every second that passed, I could see her growing more and more desperate. Linda had always been the kind of person who thought she could demand anything, that her words carried the weight of authority. But here she was realizing, in real time, that authority meant nothing when it wasn't backed by actual power. And in that moment, I knew she understood something essential. She was powerless here. Linda huffed, her breath quickening as she took a step back, clearly flustered. She began to pace in front of the gate, muttering under her breath, her eyes darting back and forth like she was trying to figure out what to do next. I watched with a strange sense of satisfaction as she rattled the chain one more time, her fury mounting, but nothing changed. The gate stood firm, unyielding, and so was I. I could hear her voice from where I stood, even if she wasn't speaking directly to me. "This isn't over," she shouted, almost as if the words themselves might convince the lock to release. Her hands were balled into fists now, her face flushed with frustration, the skin around her eyes tightening with each breath. She was trapped in her own game, a game she hadn't expected to lose. But here she was, stuck at the gates of my property, literally locked out, her plans crumbling around her. I could feel a sense of power growing inside me. It wasn't about being petty. It wasn't about rubbing it in her face. It was about standing my ground, about sending a message that I wouldn't be steamrolled, that I was in control of my own life. She continued to fume, pulling at the chain again, but I could see it now, the first flickers of doubt in her eyes. She had come here with all the confidence in the world, expecting everything to fall into place the way she had imagined. But instead, she was left standing there, a woman at the gates of a property that wouldn't let her in, a person who thought her entitlement could override reality. And I watched it all unfold, knowing that this was just the beginning of Linda's lesson. Linda's meltdown was something straight out of a movie. I had to bite my lip to suppress the urge to laugh as I watched the scene unfold before me. It was almost like watching a live-action drama where she was the lead, except in this case, she wasn't the heroic protagonist. Oh no, she was the villain, throwing a tantrum as her carefully crafted plans crumbled around her. There she was, standing at the gate, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, hands on her hips in a stance that screamed both defiance and frustration. Her body was stiff, and I could see her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts, like she was trying to steady herself, trying to regain some sense of control over a situation she had no handle on. But the more she shouted, the more absurd it all became. "Why aren't you letting us in?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the microphone of my security system, reaching me loud and clear in my living room. "This is ridiculous. I have a reservation for this house. You can't just lock me out like this." The sheer entitlement of her tone was almost comical. She truly believed that, despite all evidence to the contrary, I owed her something. She thought that because she had somehow convinced herself that this event was hers to commandeer, that she could waltz up and take over without a second thought. It was as if her expectations of authority came from nowhere but her own self-righteousness. And the longer she stood there, yelling at the locked gate, the more absurd the entire situation felt. I could barely hold in my laughter. Here was a grown woman, standing before a heavy, secure gate, trying to reason with it. She tugged at the chain again, trying to pull it free with all her might. Each failed attempt only made her more frantic. At first, she was yelling at the gate, as if it could hear her and understand the force of her frustration. But when that didn't work, she turned her ire toward me, as if somehow her emotional outbursts would magically make me open the gate. "Why are you doing this to me?" she shouted through the intercom, her voice trembling with anger. "You're ruining everything. This is my event, and I'm in charge. Open the damn gate right now." She paced in front of the gate, her footsteps quick and erratic, as though every movement would somehow unlock the solution to her problem. I couldn't help but watch, mesmerized by the unfolding spectacle. It was like watching a bad performance, one where the actor thought their role was more important than the script itself. Linda was playing the part of a frustrated event planner whose world was falling apart, and she was completely oblivious to the fact that it was all her own doing. At one point, she even started shaking the chain violently, as though sheer physical force would get her what she wanted. But the chain didn't budge. Of course it didn't. This wasn't some flimsy lock or a loose gate. I had taken my time to make sure everything was secure. This was a heavy-duty chain, thick and unyielding. But Linda wasn't backing down. No, she was relentless. In the midst of her fury, she started accusing me of sabotaging her event. "You're ruining everything," she screamed, her face flushed with rage. "You're trying to sabotage the HOA event, aren't you?" Her words didn't make sense. How was I sabotaging anything when I was simply protecting my own property? But in her mind, this was personal. I wasn't just a homeowner defending my rights. I was the villain in her story, the one standing in the way of what she believed was hers for the taking. She had convinced herself that I was purposefully ruining her carefully laid plans. And then, as though she had found some new, powerful weapon, she shouted, "I'm calling the HOA. You'll regret this." I rolled my eyes, leaning back in my chair. Her empty threats were just part of the performance at this point. The HOA, the supposed authority she was calling on, had already been informed of my side of the story. I'd already made sure that everything was documented, my emails, my phone calls, my direct conversations with them. She could call them all she wanted. They weren't going to back her up. But that didn't stop her from shouting threats into the air, hoping that someone, anyone, would come to her rescue. As I watched this unfold, a sense of amusement bubbled up inside me. It was like a show, and I was the sole audience member, witnessing a train wreck in real time. Linda had no idea that I was watching her every move, that I was monitoring the entire scene from the comfort of my living room. There was something almost poetic about the way she was fumbling through every step of her breakdown. It was as though she had no clue that I was watching her unravel, that her tantrum was nothing more than a dramatic, desperate attempt to maintain control in a situation where she had no power at all. She raged for over an hour, the minutes stretching out as she went from one tactic to the next, trying to find a way to break through. She even tried calling out for help, her voice rising in pitch as she pleaded with an invisible audience. I could hear her voice cracking, the frustration and anger overtaking her every word. "Somebody help me," she cried out, her voice reaching a near hysteria. "This isn't fair. I have a right to this event." She yelled at the sky, at the trees, at the air itself, hoping, I suppose, that someone might intervene and rescue her from the locked gate. She was completely losing it, and the more she yelled, the more absurd it seemed. Each outburst, each accusatory word, only served to highlight how out of touch she was with reality. She wasn't in control here. The gate was locked, the chain was secure, and the property wasn't hers to take. But Linda couldn't see that. Instead, she was trapped in her own narrative, unable to break free from the delusion that the event was somehow meant to happen. The best part? She had no idea I was watching the entire thing unfold. There she was, alone in front of the gate, screaming at a locked chain, throwing all her energy into something she couldn't control, while I sat in my living room, sipping a drink and watching the spectacle through my security cameras. The irony wasn't lost on me. Linda, the supposed authority figure, was completely powerless in this moment. As the hours wore on, I could see her energy begin to wane. Her pace slowed, her shouting became less frequent, and her defiance started to crack. She walked around the gate, trying different angles, hoping that one of them would lead her to some solution, but nothing changed. Her world was shrinking around her, and she had no idea how to fix it. She was stuck, and she knew it. The more she realized that her tantrum wasn't going to get her what she wanted, the more visibly frustrated she became. But the most entertaining part? The moment she finally gave up. It was subtle at first, just a slight slump of her shoulders, a defeated sigh. But it was clear she was coming to terms with the fact that she wasn't getting in. The realization hit her slowly, and yet all at once. She stood there, hands on her hips, breathing heavily, clearly exhausted from all the futile exertion. And then, in the quietest, most defeated tone, she muttered to herself, "This isn't over." It was the perfect ending to a perfectly absurd afternoon. Linda had spent over an hour raging against something she couldn't control, and she had no idea that I had been watching her from the safety of my living room the entire time. I had expected a spectacle, but even I couldn't have predicted just how entertaining it would be to witness her unravel. It was, in every sense of the word, a complete meltdown, and I was thoroughly enjoying every moment of it. After what felt like an eternity of screaming, futile attempts to break the chain, and desperate pleas for someone, anyone, to come and open the gate, Linda finally gave up. It wasn't an abrupt end to her fury, but a slow, bitter resignation that seeped into her every movement. One by one, she stopped trying to break the chain, each failed attempt taking more of her energy, until finally, she stood still, her hands falling to her sides, utterly defeated. For a moment, the air was thick with silence. The only sound was her ragged breathing, a stark contrast to the furious yelling that had filled the air just moments earlier. She stood there motionless, her shoulders slumped in defeat, as if the weight of the situation had finally settled on her. Her face, once flushed with rage, was now pale, the anger gradually giving way to embarrassment. It was a sight I would remember for a long time. She was caught, not just physically, locked out by the very gate she thought she could breeze past, but in a way, she was caught in her own lies, her own delusions of entitlement. I watched her as she stood there, defeated, in the middle of my property, facing the reality she was too proud to acknowledge for so long. And then, without another word, without so much as a backward glance at the gate or the situation she had made for herself, Linda stormed off toward her car. Her steps were heavy, purposeful, each one filled with anger and frustration, but underneath all that was the unmistakable sound of someone who knew they had lost. She was defeated, but her pride wouldn't allow her to admit it. There was no apology, no sign of recognition that perhaps she had overstepped. No, instead, she muttered angrily to herself, her voice barely audible, but still carrying the sting of bitterness. As she reached her car, I could see her hands gripping the door handle with such force, as if trying to will herself back into control, to regain some semblance of power over a situation she had completely lost. She threw herself into the car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed the defeat she had just experienced. I didn't need to hear her muttering from inside the car to know what she was thinking. She was seething, no doubt replaying the entire encounter in her head, finding new ways to blame me, to shift the responsibility for what had just happened. But in the end, it didn't matter. The reality was clear. She had lost. It was a small victory for me, a momentary satisfaction that made my heart swell with a quiet sense of triumph. But it wasn't just about the victory itself. It was about the message it sent, both to Linda and to anyone else who might think they could walk all over me in the future. I had stood my ground. I had protected my space. And it felt so sweet. There was a sense of finality in the way she had left, her car kicking up dirt as it sped down the driveway, leaving behind the chaos of her failed plans. It was over. And for me, it was the beginning of taking control of my own life once again. But I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Linda was the type of person who didn't just accept defeat. No, she would try to turn the tables in her own way. I was fully aware that she would report me to the HOA. She was far too invested in her own sense of entitlement to just walk away without trying to make me pay for what had just happened. But as I watched her car disappear down the road, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I was ready for her. I had already taken the steps to ensure that if she did report me, the situation would be handled fairly and transparently. I had reached out to the HOA earlier in the day, explaining everything in clear, concise detail. I laid out the facts. Linda had never booked my property. There had been no reservation, and most importantly, she had no authority to make any such booking through the HOA system. I had also included the screenshots of my communications with Linda and the HOA, along with timestamps, making it clear that she had fabricated the entire situation. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not now, not ever. And I wasn't going to let her falsely accuse me of sabotaging anything when, in reality, it was her behavior that was unprofessional, entitled, and completely outside the bounds of the HOA's guidelines. As I sat down in the living room, the adrenaline slowly fading, I realized how calculated my actions had been. From locking the gates, to setting up the cameras, to making sure the HOA had all the information they needed. I had played the situation perfectly. Everything was in place. There was no way Linda could twist the truth now. No way she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. The evidence was on my side, and I was prepared for any fallout that might come from her complaints. But that wasn't the only thing I was prepared for. I was ready for the emotional toll that her next steps would bring. I knew she would probably try to escalate the situation, involve other HOA members, and drag out her complaint as much as possible. But I was confident that the HOA, once they saw the truth, would back me up. They had to. The guidelines were clear, and Linda had crossed several lines by trying to take control of my property without any authority. This wasn't a minor misunderstanding. It was an abuse of power, and it needed to be addressed. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. It was strange how peaceful the house seemed now, after the storm that had passed through. The lake outside glistened in the fading light, the wind rustling through the trees. It was as if the world had returned to its natural rhythm, as though the chaos that had just unfolded was nothing more than a distant memory. The phone buzzed, snapping me out of my reverie. I glanced at it, recognizing the number as the HOA's main line. My stomach fluttered, but it wasn't fear. It was a sense of anticipation. This was it. I picked up the phone and answered calmly, my voice steady. "Hello." The voice on the other end was polite, but businesslike. "Hi, is this the owner of the lake house at address?" "Yes, this is," I replied, my tone even. "We received a complaint from Linda regarding an event that was supposed to take place at your property this weekend. We just wanted to follow up on this matter. Could you explain your side of the situation?" I paused for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "I'm glad you called. I've already provided you with all the necessary information, but I'd be happy to explain everything again. Linda never booked my property. She tried to claim that she had, but it was a complete fabrication. I've already sent over my communication with her, along with the relevant details, so you can see that I never authorized such an event. I've also taken the liberty of documenting everything, including the steps I took to ensure the property was secured. The bottom line is that Linda has no authority to make such bookings, and she was attempting to force her way into my private property without permission." The silence on the other end was brief, but telling. "Thank you for the clarification. We'll review the situation and get back to you shortly. We appreciate your cooperation." The call ended shortly after, leaving me with a sense of finality. I had done everything I could to protect myself and my property. Now, it was in the hands of the HOA. But I wasn't worried. I had done my due diligence. I had followed the rules. And I had stood up for myself. As I sat back in my chair, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Linda had lost this battle, not just because she had been locked out, but because she had tried to impose her will on someone who wasn't willing to back down. This wasn't just about the lake house or the HOA. This was about taking a stand, about refusing to let someone dictate the terms of your life. And I had won. The battle was over, but the lesson lingered. As Linda's car drove off, I couldn't help but smile. The moral of this story is simple. Never let anyone take advantage of you, especially when it comes to your own property. Trust your instincts and stand your ground. It's easy to get intimidated by people who think they have more power than they do. But if you know your rights and you're willing to fight for them, you'll always come out on top. And for Linda? Well, she learned that messing with the wrong person can lead to a very embarrassing, very public lesson.